Welcome to another episode of The Dog's Voice, the podcast where we talk about puppies, their health, and all things dog related. I'm your host, Ben the Vet. This podcast is being brought to you by the Dog Breeding Reform Group, where we're working really hard to improve the health and welfare of dogs and support responsible breeding and informed dog care. We have a really fantastic guest joining us today in Vanessa Barnes. Vanessa is a lawyer who specialises in animal welfare law and acts as a legal advisor to APGAW, which stands for the All-Parliamentary Group for Animal Welfare. So today we're going to be chatting lots about the legal aspects of pet ownership and acquisition. Hi Vanessa, thanks very much for taking the time to join us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for having me here.
No problem. We're recording this on a very hot day in May. So I was just talking to Vanessa a bit before we started about how uncomfortably hot it's been, which is possibly slightly relevant to some of our discussions later, which we'll come on to more. Maybe we could just start off by hearing a bit more, Vanessa, about what you do at APGAW and how you got into this area of law.
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of came to animal welfare law fairly organic route, I suppose. Obviously, my background is in law. I was a solicitor working in private practice. And so I did my undergraduate degree and then I did a master's degree in law as well. And then went off to practice as a solicitor in personal injury insurance litigation for a while. And then...
So very, very, very different.
Very, very different. A very long way from animal welfare law. But I took a career break after our third child, sort of focus on family. And at that point, we had bought somewhere that had a few fields and decided, I've always been passionate about animals and always had a real sort of love of being around them, decided to get some sheep and pigs and chickens and horses and create a bit of a small holding, and kind of realised that I was never happier than when I was either out in a lambing barn pulling a lamb out of a sheep in the middle of the night, or just generally being sort of hanging out with my animals, and became very sort of interested in animal welfare in particular, and then was looking for a way to connect that with my legal professional training. So decided to go back to university and do a postgraduate degree in animal welfare science, policy and legislation, which I loved. Really was the sort of the link between my previous legal career, if you like, and my passion for animal welfare. And that then set me on the route to joining APGAW, as you mentioned, as their legal advisor. And I'm also now doing various other roles. I'm a member of the legal advisory group for extreme conformation in dogs, bit of a mouthful. And more recently, I've been appointed to be a member of an expert panel for DARA, the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs over in Northern Ireland. And I'm currently helping them to review their dog breeding regulations in Northern Ireland. So everything's kind of expanded and built on from those years ago when I first decided to get a few sheep, I suppose.
Yeah, it's lovely. I suppose that's always the aim, isn't it? That if you can bring your passion into your day-to-day work. What's that saying, that you never work a day in your life if you do something you're truly passionate about?
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Acting as a legal advisor for APGAW, what does that work actually entail, like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so, well, I wouldn't say that I work for them every day, because obviously I'm doing various other roles as well. And it's all sort of completely voluntary, the work that I'm currently doing for APGAW. Basically, as their legal advisor, I'm sort of providing analysis on proposed and existing legislation, and also looking at specific work streams that APGAW might be involved in. And we have a range of animal welfare work streams that are ongoing at all times. The dog breeding one is just one of those. And look at strategies and ways in which either the current law could assist in finding solutions for currently tricky animal welfare issues, or gaps in the current law and what we might be wanting to consider in terms of how we could develop strategies to plug those gaps, whether that would be from a legislative perspective or an enforcement perspective, and sort of helping to try to find practical routes that either existing current legislation or potentially proposing new legislation might provide to find solutions to often quite tricky problems.
The law, is one of those areas where, particularly as a vet, and I'm meeting dog owners every day, there are certain things that I think most pet owners are aware of. Like, most people know that their dog needs to have a microchip, and they're aware of their need to provide a certain level of care for their pet. But maybe I think there are definitely areas where there are some of the specific legal obligations that people have as dog owners they're maybe not necessarily aware of. And I don't think that's necessarily anybody's fault. But I mean, in your view, what are the main sort of blind spots that people seem to have? What I say about microchipping, a lot of people that I meet will get a puppy, and certainly I do meet people that aren't aware that their puppy is supposed to have a microchip by the age of 8 weeks of age. But that's just one example.
Yeah, no, it's surprising, really, I suppose, how little awareness there is of some of the laws that are in place relating to dog ownership and responsible dog ownership. And I think, as you say, most owners, they are aware of the basics. That, I think most people have a general awareness about the need to keep the dog under control and, as you say, microchipping. But beyond that, I think there are some quite significant gaps in public knowledge. I think most owners are aware that they have a duty to take care of their animal, that, under the Animal Welfare Act, they might not know the name of the act, but they know that there's something that requires them to have a positive impact on their dog's welfare, and certainly to make sure they don't do anything cruel to them. I'm not sure, actually, going back to that, how many people realise that the duty is quite proactive. It's not just about not starving your dog or not ill-treating them. Many owners don't genuinely understand that they're actually legally required to make sure that their dog's positive welfare needs are met, that they can exhibit their normal behaviours, that they have the opportunity to exercise freely and do various other positive welfare actions rather than just protecting them from poor health or cruelty or things like that. I think there are other areas where then people are not aware of the actual control laws, and that these have changed quite a bit in terms of what you should be doing as a responsible dog owner, particularly around livestock and horses as well. That's something I'm quite passionate about. There's nothing that will chill a horse rider more than being on a horse and a loose dog charging up to you barking, and you're thinking, oh, please get this dog back under control.
It's so dangerous, isn't it? It's so much danger for the dog, for the rider, for the horse. It's an area that the rules have been tightened up sort of recently, have they? Or they're going to be quite soon, I think?
Yeah, no, very recently. There's been a brand new sort of Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Act, which actually just came into force in the middle of March. And that's really substantially updated the law surrounding livestock worrying. We did have already some laws relating to livestock, but that was from a 1953 Act. That only applied to offences that were committed on agricultural land. So basically, if your dog was going across farmland and started to chase or attack livestock whilst on that agricultural land, there was an offence already. And I think hopefully most people will be aware that that's an offence. Again, I'm not, I think some owners might say, oh, it wasn't my fault, they're off their lead and I didn't realise they were going to do that. But I'll come back to that in a moment. But where this new act comes into play is it closes what we call the agricultural land gap. So basically it extends the protections to livestock which are on a public road or a bridle way, and horses are defined as livestock under this act, so they would be covered. The only thing to mention is that, as often with these laws, there is a slight caveat in place with this, in that the wording of the act specifically mentions it's when livestock is being moved on a public road or a bridle way. So it's a slightly tenuous argument. So I think what they were thinking of is that this covers the instance where a farmer perhaps is moving their sheep across a footpath or a bridle way or down a road, and they're moving their flock from one place to another, or moving whatever livestock it might be involved. And using this word moving, it might not apply to sort of hobby riding when you're taking your horse out on a bridle way. So I know this is something that the British Horse Society is still a bit concerned about in terms of whether or not it would actually fully protect a horse that's being ridden on a public bridle way, as opposed to a horse that's just being moved from one field to the next. And that sort of remains still a bit of a legal question, which we'll have to see ultimately how the courts interpret that if and when there are any cases brought under it. But certainly it's a positive step in the right direction to make sure that this gap where attacks do take place off farmers' land or where livestock is kept is now, at least to a certain extent, covered.
So was that a sort of loophole where if there was a public footpath or a bridleway going through a field, that would be a sort of loophole that would prevent dog owners being prosecuted?
I think potentially, if you could say that the livestock was also on the public footpath at the time, if the dog had strayed off and was then very much definitely, within the field at large, if you like, then that would be different. I think people, just going back to sort of their understanding, they don't have as much of a clear understanding of what it means to have a dog under close control. And that's not been very well defined currently, but certainly the premise behind it is not that it's enough to just be able to have your dog 30, 40 metres away in an area where there's livestock, where just the presence of the dog can cause a great degree of worry and agitation amongst the livestock. You should really have your dog under very close control, i.e. walking to heel. Preferably the dog should be on a lead. And certainly, As I said, I keep sheep and horses, and I have dogs as well. My dogs are very used to being around sheep and horses, but I would never even trust my own dogs in my own field with my sheep. I would always put them on a lead, because at the end of the day, dogs are dogs. They have a very strong chasing instinct, and sheep are sheep. And they have a very strong flight instinct. And a dog that thinks, well, this is just a great game, I love to chase and they love to run, doesn't perhaps realise that actually what they're doing is a huge amount of harm to that animal. And, sheep can abort their lambs if they get particularly agitated and worried. It doesn't need to be an actual physical attack for the offence to be committed. It's enough for there to be worrying. So it's quite broad in that respect. And I think people would be quite surprised if they found that out.
And I think people, maybe they just don't understand how serious that can be. They might see their dog chasing some sheep and think, oh, well, my dog hasn't bitten the sheep. What's the problem? But obviously, apart from that being very distressing for the animals, there is that risk of them aborting. Close to lambing time, there is really quite a significant risk that the sheep can abort purely due to stress, and that can cause huge losses for farmers.
Oh, absolutely. I think I was reading the latest estimates, or the estimates from last year, of cost, if you like, to farmers or to GDP. It's around about £2 million per year in terms of lost livestock from livestock worrying or livestock attacks. So it's not an insignificant problem. And I think increasingly where we have more and more dog owners, that the dog population has definitely gone up a lot over the years, and people wanting to take their dogs out into the countryside more and more. These encounters are becoming more common. And I think there was a 10% increase last year, and it's certainly something that government and the NFU are very aware of and wanting to try to address.
Particularly people who live in rural areas, always own dogs, know about these risks and know that they need to keep their dog under control. But perhaps it's people that are not familiar with livestock farming, behaviour of those animals, and that they just don't really think about these things. Another area I was thinking about on this topic is people do legally have to keep their dog under control on a public road. And that's quite a big bugbear of mine, is driving down a busy road and seeing somebody walking their dog with no lead. People aren't technically allowed to do that, are they? On a designated road, I think the law states.
Yeah, I think there's something in the highway code about that maybe as well. I must confess, I don't know the ins and outs of that particular law, but certainly I think, if a dog is, again, out of control and causes harm to a person, presumably by causing a road traffic accident potentially, there could be some serious implications as a result of that.
When I was, 14, I remember walking down the street and seeing somebody's Shih Tzu that was off lead just run into the road directly under the wheel of a van. We went with them to the vets. Unfortunately, miraculously, somehow this dog was completely fine. But I then saw the same people walking this dog off lead in the same area a few weeks later. And you just think, do you not learn from that incident? I mean, how can we improve education in this area? In my mind, it falls in the same sort of category as other life skills in terms of like financial literacy, for example. We all have to pay taxes and set up pensions. But education in schools on those topics is quite lacking. And in the same way, we know that a lot of people have dogs. I think it's a third of UK adults have a dog, but actually pet care and basic animal welfare law is not really taught in schools. So are we maybe expecting too much of people to know these things? I guess, how do we get sort of education to people?
I think that's a really interesting point, and you're absolutely spot on. It's if we tackle a lot of these things from an early age and kind of you drum the messages in, then it has far more likelihood of being translated to when that child becomes an adult and gets their own animal, that they're going to have a better understanding of what the rules are and also general care and things like that for the animal that is in their control. I think there's a lot more that could and should be done in schools. I mean, I appreciate that schools have a huge range of subjects and things on the curriculum which they have to get through. And I think you're right also about the financial, you're setting people up to understand about finances and the real world and so on. But I think if we started at primary level, just having some basic ideas around cruelty to animals and how caring for animals should look and what animals' needs are, and also a bit of myth busting. I think, as you are aware, have spent a lot of time at APGAW trying to tackle the issue of extreme conformation dog breeding. I think if there was better awareness from a younger age that actually some of these supposedly cute features that are on pencil cases and mugs and on their cartoon shows are actually not much fun for the dog themselves. And, you start to get that message into children that, actually, do you think that dog is particularly comfortable having those levels of skin folds, or do you think it's okay that that dog is panting and struggling to breathe so much, rather than just letting these subliminal messages from social media go through to children and young people that actually this is really cute, or it's fashionable, or the latest celebrity pop star or whoever has got this particular breed of animal and therefore it must be okay. I think there's a lot that we have done to normalise not just how animals look, but also how we treat them, which we should be rowing back on now and taking some steps back and undoing. And I think a lot of that does start with education and education at school. But I think taking it away from putting more burdens on schools, and there's more that we could be doing with new dog owners. I know some countries have taken the initiative of actually putting in place a system where owners either have to do some form of mandatory online course before they are able to get a new dog, or at least have to sign a certificate to confirm that they've read appropriately around it and they understand what their requirements are and they understand what the animal's needs might be. France has done this. Austria has also got a certificate of competence that they require all dog owners to complete before they get a dog. And actually Scotland's going down this route as well with the Welfare of Dogs Scotland Act in 2025 that was introduced. And that requires a code of practice on welfare of dogs to be published, and crucially for a certificate to be signed by both the breeder and the new acquirer, owner of a dog, confirming that they've read and that they understand the code of practice on caring for the dog. So I think there's more that we could do around there, and certainly looking at Northern Ireland, so the review that I've been doing there and looking at their system, separate to the dog breeding regulations, which is a piece in its own right. Northern Ireland also have the old-fashioned dog licensing, if you like, that we used to have in England. And I think that would offer a moment of pause, if you like, when people are applying for a license. That would be the perfect opportunity at that point to provide people with more information on what it means to own a dog, what they should be doing.
I think, just introducing that formal step will just help to reinforce the fact having a dog, it is a big responsibility, isn't it? You have a moral duty, there are legal responsibilities. And at the moment, getting a puppy, I've said on other episodes of the podcast, if I decided I wanted a puppy this afternoon, tomorrow, I could probably go and pick one up, which is dangerous, isn't it, really? So
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
there needs to be, that moment of pause would be a helpful thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it is a really important undertaking, and there are offences that could be committed by your dog that could see you go to prison. If your dog is dangerously out of control and attacks somebody else. And it's therefore really important that you understand the extent of your legal obligations, that it's not good enough just to say, let the dog out in the morning and you'll let it back in at night and let it wander the streets, for instance, and do whatever it wants in between time and say, I wasn't there, so I didn't know what the dog was doing. There is a whole host of requirements, not just around the care of the dog, but also about the interactions that dog can have with others and with other animals that needs to be considered as well.
And so for, going back to that first step then of somebody deciding that they want to get a puppy, that's obviously a topic we focus on a lot on episodes on the podcast. At that point, what are some of the most important things that people need to understand from a legal perspective when they're getting a puppy?
Well, they should certainly be very careful about where they're sourcing that puppy from. I think there is, as you said, a situation that has arisen where you could probably get a puppy this evening, actually, Penny. I know you said if you decided to get one, you wanted one this afternoon, you could get one tomorrow. You could probably get one much, much quicker than that.
Yeah.
So I think people should be really responsible and insightful about how they do their research.
Yeah.
Is this a breeder that is a legitimate breeder? Have you fully checked them out? Are they a licensed breeder? Have you checked that they do have the appropriate licenses to breed with their local authority? If they are a licensed breeder, you should always see a puppy in the presence of its mother and from the premises where it's been reared. And that gives you that reassurance that this is not a stooge situation where potentially a puppy has been trafficked and the environment has been made to set up to look like it's a responsible breeder, and in actual fact they've just rented an Airbnb and they're using that as a kind of front to pass the puppy through, and they sort of say, I haven't got the mum here or whatever. You should make sure that you have seen mum and preferably dad, and that you've done as much of your due diligence as you can, that you've checked things like vaccination records and that you've checked microchipping and put yourself as much in the picture as possible in terms of the provenance of the puppy. And then, of course, once you have got the puppy, you should make sure that you change those microchip details so that it's your name and your address that's then on the microchip, so that the dog is able to be reunited with you. And then all of the Animal Welfare Act provisions come in about ensuring that you are taking that level of care for your puppy and your dog as it grows up and adjusting for their needs. Under Section 4 and Section 9 of the Animal Welfare Act, you have a legal requirement to make sure that any animal in your care does not experience any unnecessary suffering. And that applies in varying degrees depending on the breed of dog. Some dogs may come with health and welfare issues, unfortunately, bred into them. Now, you as the owner are then going to be the person that is going to have the requirement of adequately providing for those health and welfare needs. And so you need to make sure that you are going into everything with your eyes very much open as to what the requirements are going to look like for you on a long-term basis.
I mean, this leads quite naturally into discussion about this trend towards people wanting to own dogs that have an extreme appearance. So we're talking about lots of different dog breeds here, particularly the brachycephalics, so the flat-faced breeds like the pugs and the bulldogs that have the squished face, and that causes a variety of health and welfare problems. What's different if people choose to own one of those breeds? What's different in terms of their obligations or responsibilities as a pet owner?
Well, it's not so much, I suppose, that the obligations are different. It's just that the obligation, in a way, it's that the obligations are the same in that they have to make sure that there is a prevention of harm, that they're not unduly suffering. And then beyond that, that there's a positive promotion of their welfare, that they have everything that they need to be able to lead the fullest, best life that they can, if you like, that they can exhibit their normal behaviours and that they are protected as much as possible from pain, suffering, injury and disease. So that is a requirement regardless of what the breed is. But if you have a breed which comes, if you like, with baked-in problems, you're going to have to work extra hard to make sure that those legal obligations can be met, that you are doing what you can to protect that animal from pain, suffering, and that they can exhibit their normal behaviours. So that might mean that you're going to have to put a lot more effort into getting appropriate veterinary care, veterinary interventions perhaps. So we've had this very, very hot weather, for instance. Now, this would cause a problem for most dogs, the kind of heat we've had over the last few days, sort of 35 degrees, and you shouldn't be taking any dog out in these sort of temperatures. But for the brachycephalic breeds, they also have an increased difficulty in thermoregulating and respiratory issues as well. So for a dog such as that, you as their owner, you have a duty to go an extra mile, if you like, make sure that they really are going to be comfortable and protected from the extremes of heat, and that their physical needs are really taken care of in times like this. So it's not so much that they have additional legal requirements, it's just that the legal requirements are probably going to feel more onerous if you've got a dog that comes with quite a lot of health and welfare issues that you then have to make modifications for.
There are parts of the law that relate to extreme conformation, aren't there? And I know that there is a law as part of some of the dog breeding regulations, I think, that states a dog should not be bred if it can be predicted from the dog's genetics or appearance that its offspring are likely to suffer as a result. So is it against the law to breed a pug if we know that they're going to experience this variety of sort of health problems?
Well, it depends on who is doing the breeding at the moment. So the law that you're talking about is the licensing regulations that apply to licensed breeders. So the licensing of activities involving animals regulations 2018. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we call it the layer eggs for short. And these apply just to those breeders who are breeding on a commercial basis. So that tends to mean that they're breeding more than 3 litters of puppies per year, or selling puppies in the course of running a business, so for generating profit. That test, the business test, the profit test, can be difficult to apply. So I'm not going to get drawn into that one too much, but it can be a little bit ambiguous as to what people interpret as being a business and whether they feel that their activities have crossed over that threshold. But certainly if you were breeding 3 litters of puppies per year or more, you are required to have a license from your local authority. And as part of those licensing requirements, you have to follow the provisions of the licensing regulations. And one of those provisions, as you mentioned, is Schedule 665, which is the requirement to ensure that a dog is suitable to breed from, and that nothing about the dog's state of health or genotype could either cause issues for the breeding dog themselves, and I think that's an important distinction, or could affect the health or welfare of any of the future puppies that are born. So yes, absolutely. If somebody is a licensed breeder and they know that they have a dog who has extreme conformational traits, exaggerated physical features, which are likely to be passed on to their progeny, and that these physical conformational traits can cause health and welfare issues, then they definitely could find themselves in breach of that provision and committing an offence under those regulations. Now, unfortunately, as with many laws, there is a hiccup with this one, and it's down to quite a large degree of ambiguity and subjectivity in the wording of how the provisions have been drafted. So it talks about breeders need to have a reasonable expectation that harm won't result, and they must take reasonable steps to ensure that a dog is suitable to breed. But then there's no actual guidance as to what these reasonable steps might be. So you can find yourself in a situation where a breeder is not really aware of what steps they should have perhaps taken before putting two dogs together and deciding to make a pairing from them. And equally a situation where the local authority is slightly hamstrung and dealing with a situation where breeders are saying, well, I didn't reasonably expect that this would happen, and I thought I'd taken reasonable steps. This is the way the breed is supposed to look, or something along those lines. And as a result, we know that enforcement of this provision is extremely poor. The Legal Advisory Group for Extreme Conformation in Dogs, who I mentioned before I'm a member of, has just published, actually yesterday, I think it was, a recent report we've done on exactly this, how well this provision is being enforced in practical terms. So when you consider that these regulations were passed in 2018 in England, there has only actually been 31 cases of non-compliance action brought by local authorities across the whole of England in respect of this particular provision since they were brought in. And yet we know that there are countless thousands and thousands of dogs being bred every year to have extreme conformations which affect the health and welfare of their offspring. So I think when you have that disconnect, and in fact the figures also show that there was not a single non-compliance case in Scotland, since Scotland's regulations came in slightly later, they were 2021, but still in a 5-year period, not a single non-compliance case, even though we know there are plenty of these types of dogs being bred by licensed breeders. And then even if you're not a licensed breeder, you still have to take into consideration the welfare of the breeding dog themselves. So for some of these dogs that have very extreme conformations, as you mentioned the Purk or the French Bulldog, the brachycephalic breeds, the flat-faced breeds, they can already have quite a significantly impaired respiratory function. If you subject that dog, and I say subject because as a breeder you're choosing to get that dog pregnant and to say this dog's going to have pups, the act of pregnancy and the whelping can create a significant additional respiratory impairment for a dog that is already impaired, is already suffering in that regard. Plus, a lot of these dogs have to have a cesarean section. They can't give birth naturally. And that is a degree of, going back to the Animal Welfare Act in Section 4, which says you must not do anything which causes any unnecessary suffering to an animal. Well, arguably that would be unnecessary suffering. That dog did not need to go through the act of pregnancy and whelping. That's been a deliberate decision taken by the breeder. The breeder has the knowledge that the dog is already in respiratory distress, and yet they've decided to breed from that dog anyway. And obviously, with this instance, I'm talking about dogs who do have already clinical signs of respiratory impairment. So you could find yourself falling foul of the Animal Welfare Act if you took that type of breeding decision. And that applies to all breeders, not just licensed breeders. That applies equally to one-off breeders, hobby breeders, if you like, to registered kennel club breeders, to commercial licensed breeders. The law is the same regardless of who is the actual breeder in that instance. But it is only in terms of the welfare of the puppies themselves and actually stopping puppies from being bred in the first place to have these extreme conformations. It's currently only licensed breeders who have any legal requirement to consider that. Personally, I don't think that's right. I think that all dogs should have a right to not be deliberately bred to have deformities and to have welfare issues that are inherited and which could be avoided. But that's currently what the law says on that.
I guess it also encourages breeders that are not breeding dogs in a responsible way to try and avoid coming under the licensing scheme, doesn't it? Because they don't, to avoid the scrutiny.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's certainly an argument that on a fairness level, should licensed breeders have to have these additional requirements placed upon them when other people may be either breeding under the radar or just making sure that their breeding stays within the legal limits for not getting a license, don't have to follow the same level of welfare regulatory scrutiny. I do think that we should be considering more what the regulatory picture should be for licensed breeders, and also looking at enforcement, because this is all linked, and that a law is only as good as the enforcement that goes with it. And you can have the best laws in the world, but if they're not then implemented correctly or enforced as fully as they could or should be, then the law will fall down on that front.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because we do on paper have some of the strongest animal welfare laws in the world, don't we? But it's the enforcement where things often fall down. But I suppose, we're talking about this, not just enforcement, when we're talking about this legal obligation to not breed dogs that are predictably going to suffer, it's the context of society, isn't it? That some of these breeds, the French bulldogs, they have been some of the most popular dog breeds around over the last few years. And it's humans that are enforcing this legislation, inspectors, but the whole context of society means that it's been completely normalized to breed these dogs in spite of the fact that they struggle to exercise and to give birth naturally, and all of these big problems. I know you've been very involved in the development of the Innate Health Assessment, and I guess part of that really is to try and kind of make clear where the line in the sand is, helping to kind of clear up what is acceptable and what's not in terms of appearance that we're aiming to breed dogs with.
Absolutely. When we were looking, I say we, APGAW, we're looking at the issue of extreme conformation breeding. And as you said, looking at the volumes of dogs that are being bred to have extreme conformations, and also the extent of the exaggeration of these features, became clear to us that this was a major welfare issue that needed to be addressed. And that one of the key areas where it was falling down currently was the lack of any tool to help people to assess whether a dog is suitable to breed. As I mentioned before, in terms of why we think the layer regulations may be less effective than they should be and not being enforced, is down to this reasonable expectation. What is a breeder supposed to reasonably know about breeding dogs before they put them together, and what are the reasonable steps? Well, the Innate Health Assessment is very much developed in order to help breeders provide this really quick visual 10-point assessment going through some key conformational criteria, helping a breeder to really look at the dog in front of them. There's no scans or x-rays or, sorry Ben, vets required. They can do the test themselves. It's all free to do from our website, and they can run the checklist of conformational criteria and just satisfy themselves that that dog is suitable to breed. They can download a certificate from the IHA tool at the end if the dog passes the test, to show that the dog has passed, and they can do the same for the stud dog, because obviously the puppy comes from both of them, so it's important that both dogs are checked. And that can be hugely reassuring for prospective purchasers to know that the innate health, the sort of building blocks, if you like, the fundamental foundation stones for having good innate health, these 10 sort of key conformational criteria have been checked, and that the breeding dogs are suitable. But equally, for the licensing officers who are going to do inspections at licensed premises, they can also use the tool, look at the breeding dogs in the premises to check whether or not a breeder is using dogs that are suitable, to see whether or not they think, yes, that dog does look okay, or no, that dog has failed on 3 or 4 of these criteria and really isn't suitable to be used for breeding. So it could be a useful enforcement tool for licensing officers as well. And we know that, in fact, the Welsh Government, with their animal licensing Wales, are using the tool with their local authority inspectors when they're doing inspections. But this, again, it's not, when we developed it, this is not about just licensed breeders. We really want this to be used by all breeders, by the general public as well. Going back to your point on education, and there's a lot of information on our Innate Health Assessment website about the issues with extreme conformation breeding and the importance of a dog having good innate health. So that it's also an education piece. So the public can go on, have a look at the website. We have 2 versions of the IHA, one which is more for the breeder, where they can actually enter their dog's microchip details and their own details, and they can get the certificate at the end with all of the identifying information that is needed for that. But then we also have a quick check version of the tool, which is just the criteria. It just runs you through the 10 criteria, and anyone can do that. Even if you just have an interest in dogs and you have no intention of getting one, you could just have a flick through that and have a look at it. But if you were thinking about getting a puppy and you were thinking about what type of dog to get, it would enable you to go through that checklist and get you thinking about, well, has this puppy's parents got X, Y, and Z? Have they got the level of good innate health that we're going to be confident that the puppies are also going to likewise have that? There's been a lot of sort of misinformation spread about the IHA and about potentially resulting in breed bans and 67 breeds that we're trying to get rid of, which really is entirely false and very damaging information. It's polar opposite, in fact, of what we're trying to do. We're trying to encourage breeders to breed more moderately. We're not saying that any specific breed shouldn't be bred. We're simply saying try to make sure that the eyes are not bulging too much, or the skin folds are not too excessive, or the muzzle is long enough so that the dog is able to have good respiratory function, or the legs are long enough and in proportion with the body so they have good ability to exercise freely and without suffering from joint or spinal issues. So we're really, I suppose when I was talking before about rolling back potentially to the old days when you used to go to the post office, and I'm showing my age here, and you go and buy a dog license. Actually, I'm not that old, but I can vaguely remember when there were dog licenses around. I don't think I would have been old enough to buy one. And with the IHA, we're trying to just roll back the clock a bit and say, hang on, we've gone too far with the way that some of these breeds are now being bred to look. Let's just go back a few steps. Breed them to have a little bit of a longer tail. Breed them to have a little bit of a longer leg. They can still look and be very distinctively a French Bulldog or a Pug or a Dachshund. We're not trying to eliminate any breeds at all. We're just trying to get breeds to be the healthiest version of themselves that they can be.
And that's the thing, is these breeds have changed hugely over the years and looked very, very different. They have become much more extreme over, even the last 20, 30 years, but certainly compared to 100 years ago, Bulldogs, French Bulldogs, Pugs, the average dog of those breeds would have looked very different. I think that's the thing, that the Innate Health Assessment, really the aim is for it to be innate health, the foundation for health. And I heard Dan O'Neill using this term health washing recently. And I think to sort of describe how in the breeding world, there's maybe too much focus on health testing, on DNA tests and schemes to kind of prove that a dog is healthy. But actually, those sort of forms of health tests aren't really of much value if the animal being tested is not innately healthy. They have these inherently unhealthy features. So people need to just take a step back. I guess that's the aim really of this scheme, isn't it?
Absolutely. And also for it to be accessible to everybody. I should say that the IHA is not a one-stop solution or stop, if you like, for avoiding extreme conformation or for ensuring that dog is healthy. We would always say that any breed-specific health tests should still be carried out as well. And the IHA is part of the toolkit, if you like, of potential things that you can use to try to satisfy yourself that a dog has good innate health, but it certainly isn't a standalone answer to everything, and we've never suggested that it is. But what it can also do is be hugely accessible for people. So a lot of the breed-specific tests that you just sort of mentioned before, they do require vets to be involved, they require fees, they require breeders to obviously be dedicated enough to go out and do that. What we wanted to create here was a tool which was so quick and easy to use, free of charge, that all breeders would be inclined to want to pick it up and have a go with it, and that the public can just use it as well and satisfy themselves when they're thinking about the next animal to bring into their household. And also, just as I said, as the education piece. But certainly it's not the screening tool for all health. And there's still a lot of other breed-specific health tests if you were going to be looking at particular breeds that you should undertake as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's designed to be complementary, isn't it, to all of those health tests?
Yeah, absolutely.
For anyone listening who already owns a dog of one of these breeds that has been described to have extreme conformation, so for example, they have a Pug, they have a Dachshund, what would you want them to take away from this conversation?
Well, I guess probably the main thing is to be informed about the dog that you've got and understand what the welfare needs specific to your individual dog's conformation is. If there are additional assistances that that dog requires, seek out vets who've got expertise in dealing with that. And I suppose if you're thinking of getting another dog, consider whether perhaps a dog with less extreme features might offer a better quality of life, both for the dog and for yourself. You often hear that people will say, oh, well, I'm getting another Frenchie or another X, Y, and Z dog because that's what I've always had. And that's the breed I know. And that's fine, but maybe try to see if you can find more moderate versions of them. Really look into the health requirements in a bit more detail and do your homework. Yeah, I think just be informed. I wouldn't want anybody to take anything from this conversation that suggested it was a criticism of them having the dog that they've chosen. People all love their dogs very deeply. And, many owners of flat-faced or extreme conformation breeds are actually amongst some of the most engaged and welfare conscious owners out there. They'll do anything for their dogs. So yeah, it's just making sure that you've got the information and that you understand what your dog's requirements are.
That's it, isn't it? Knowledge is power. Yeah, I think the Innate Health Assessment tool is so useful. As you say, it's freely available. So anybody who is listening, who is thinking of getting a puppy, but anyone really who's interested in dogs, Google Innate Health Assessment tool. And well worth looking at. Well, thanks again for joining us on the Dog's Voice podcast. Thanks very much, Vanessa, for joining us for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to us on your podcast platform and share it with others who care about dogs. You can learn more about our work at the Dog Breeding Reform Group and follow us on social media for more tips on finding a healthy puppy and for future episodes. Until next time, thanks for listening and for helping to give dogs a voice.